Hey guys, it's Barry here, and I'm here for part 2 of my Country Wine 101 video. So yesterday we prepared our must. We extracted the juice. I adjusted the specific gravity to get an alcohol by volume content that was desirable. I think if I didn't add sugar and adjust the specific gravity, this wine would have only come out to about 3% with the naturally occurring sugars that were in this juice. So I added sugar, adjusted the specific gravity. I brought it up to where it's gonna finish as a dry wine at about 11% alcohol. I genuinely, for my fruit wines, generally for my fruit wines, I like to stick between about 10 and 12.5% alcohol. Anything more than that, and it starts to get really, really boozy, and it doesn't always taste that great. It's a little hot. It's not quite that enjoyable. Some people like to make their wines, 15% alcohol, 20% alcohol, and they're really just rocket fuel, and to each their own, and bless those people. I really like to go more for taste and try to make something that's enjoyable. So I shoot for around 10% to 12.5% alcohol by volume. So I adjusted the specific gravity, then I adjusted the pH. I think the natural pH of this must before I added some malic acid was about 4.0 on the pH scale. We want our wines, when we're making them, to be between 3.2 and 3.6 on the pH scale. That's really the optimal range for yeast to flourish and to make sure that we're not getting any unwanted microorganisms that are going to contaminate our wine, or wild yeast that might put in some off flavors or off aromas, or other bad things like that. Can spoil your wine, can turn it into vinegar. So that's why we want to make sure that our pH is really within the optimal range. I went ahead and I added some nutrients to help the yeast for when I finally do inoculate it, and I sterilized the wine with sulfites. And I did that because we want to start with, sort of like starting with a clean canvas. As I talking about different microorganisms that can contaminate your wine. These are fruits that came from the wild. So there's naturally occurring yeast on them, there's bacteria, there's fungus, there's all kinds of different things that are just naturally occurring on this fruit, even in the air in this room. So I sterilize it with sulfites, which just sort of kills everything. And now it's been about 24 hours since I did that, and those sulfites have really now dissipated to the point where I can move on to the next step in winemaking. And so the next step that I like to take at this point is I like to add something called Pectic Enzyme. And what this is this is a product for winemakers. And what it does is all fruits and vegetables, all living all plant cells have pectin in them, and it's sort of like the cell wall. And what this does is this breaks that down. You can kind of think of it as like a vampire. It's just going to suck the living life out of that fruit, and there's going to be nothing left in the end except just shriveled, dry skin with no juice or anything. So this pectic enzyme, it's really just going to help with juice extraction, and it's also going to help with clearing the wine further down the process, because a problem that winemakers can have when they're trying to clear their wine is running into something called a pectic haze, which is just sort of a haze that's left over from the pectin that was in that fruit that didn't really fall, that just sort of refuses to fall to the bottom and settle in the bottom of the tank. So this would be the time that we add pectic enzyme. Some people add it, right when they're preparing the must initially. I've heard it's better to wait at least 18 to 24 hours after treating with sulfites, just because that can help the pectic enzyme work a little better. The next thing I would add right now would be tannins. And tannins are something that you hear people talk a lot about in drinking wine and also making wine. And these particular tannins, I believe, are made from chestnut wood. So what are tannins? That's another really great question. And the best way to think of tannins would be like this. If you were to make yourself a cup of tea, and you allowed that cup of tea to sit and steep for about a half hour, and then you came back and you drank it, And that feeling that you get on your tongue and in your mouth, that really, really astringent feeling, those are tannins. And it's really that mouthfeel. And really, in winemaking, you want a certain amount of tannins because that's going to give the wine some complexity and character, and it's going to provide balance against acidity and sweetness and alcohol. So, and which are all sort of the main flavor components of a wine. And as a winemaker, we're trying to find a nice balance between all of those things. Tannins also can help a little bit with clearing the wine further down in the clearing process as well. You can add tannins later on after fermentation if you like, and that's a very common practice. It's done all the time. So you make your wine and it's maybe just a little too sharp, or it just doesn't feel round, or it doesn't have the complexity that you want, then you can add tannins later on and play around with that if that's something that you think it still might need before you get ready to bottle it. So the next thing we would do is, if we wanted, we could inoculate this wine with yeast right now. I'm not going to do that yet because I'm going to do a technique that's called extended maceration or cold soaking in more simple terms. Basically what that means is, before I start fermenting this in a wine, I'm just going to let this juice here sit, and I'm going to let it sit on the skins of the fruit. And what that's doing is it's really just going to allow that pectic enzyme that I'm going to be adding to really, really work, and it's going to really bring out a lot more of the character of that fruit. Most of the character of a fruit really actually comes from its skin, and that's why in grape winemaking that you do see a lot that grape winemakers will macerate and ferment right on the skins. They don't just extract the juice and ferment that right in a wine. The skin contact is a really, really big part of grape winemaking, but also country winemaking as well. That's something that I've definitely found. So let's say though that I'm going to go and inoculate this with yeast, and we're going to begin our fermentation. So wine yeasts. What are wine yeasts? Another very good question. And how are wine yeasts different from bread yeasts? So a few different ways. The main difference between wine yeast and bread yeast is, if you were to use bread yeast and try to inoculate this and then fermenting it into alcohol, bread yeast, well, it's really made to make bread. It's not really made to make wine. So it can work, and it will work. I think bread yeast only has an alcohol tolerance of about usually about 7 or 8% alcohol by volume. So once the alcohol level starts to rise as it's fermenting, it actually becomes toxic to the yeast. It starts to become toxic, and so you need a yeast strain that can withstand that type of alcohol toxicity and sort of ferment past as that alcohol by volume content starts to rise in the must. So a big problem you can have if you're using bread yeast is it's going to get stuck at about 7 or 8% alcohol, and if you're trying to make a wine that's about 11%, it's going to be pretty sweet and unfinished. The other thing is, it's not going to impart great flavors into the wine. The real difference with wine yeast is not only they can yield higher alcohol by volume levels in the wine, but there's thousands of different strains of yeast. I mean, really endless strains of yeast, and these wine yeasts have been developed that each of them sort of enhances their own qualities. Some enhance fruit notes, some enhance color. So each kind of wine yeast has its own characteristics, which is really cool because there's so many different yeasts out there to play with, and kind of see which combinations work for which different kinds of wines. And that's one of my actually favorite things in winemaking, is getting to play around with different strains of yeast with different fruit wine combinations. So, but that's really the main difference here. And if I was going to inoculate this wine right now with yeast, basically what I would do is I would just mix this with a little bit of warm water, about 100-degree water, let it sit for about 20 minutes, and you're going to start to see it activate right away. I'd take just a little bit of this, I would pour it into that. Over about another hour, I would then just going to dump it all into here. Then all I really need to do is just let the wine ferment into alcohol, and I watch it. And then I'm going to come back every day and stir it just give it a little oxygen about once, twice a day. There's also going to start to be a cap that I need to punch down. And every couple days, maybe even every day, I'm going to grab my hydrometer again in my little tube, and I'm going to take a test and see how it's fermenting along. And as that wine starts fermenting into alcohol, my hydrometer is going to show a lower and lower reading. I know that it's going to end at about 0.995 on the specific gravity scale. So once though, once it starts to ferment mostly down all the way, I think I was talking yesterday about how in the very beginning we want to start in a bucket, and then once it starts fermenting into wine, oxygen becomes our enemy, and we need to move it over here to a secondary container. And then we just need to keep oxygen away from it. So as my wine starts fermenting down, usually once it's fermented about 75% of the way, that's when I'm going to the term we use is rack. I'm going to rack it from my primary container into my secondary container. And then at that point, I'm going to keep it under airlock always from that point in time. This is an airlock. It's a really, really simple piece of equipment. It's basically just a plastic tube, and I filled this with water, and I cap this right here. And what this does, this would allow any sort of gas and things like that are bubbling and going on in here to get out, but it doesn't allow anything to get in. And essentially, we're just going to keep it under airlock until it's completely fermented. Once it's completely fermented, ideally we should be left with a totally dry wine. There should be no sweetness left to it. If you taste it, it's going to be completely dry in your mouth. And that's really what we're always going for when we're making wine. If you like sweet wines, you can do a process that's called back sweetening, and you can add sugars back into it. After fermentation is done, of course, you then need to stabilize it again with some other chemicals to make sure fermentation doesn't start over again in the bottle, and then you end up with a Molotov cocktail. But basically, once it ferments about 75% of the way, we transfer it into a secondary container where it's going to finish its fermentation into a dry wine. At that point, it's going to be really cloudy. And then the next step is we just need to let everything clear. And that is really just where time comes in. Some wines can clear right away within a week or two. Some wines take months, even a year or more to clear on their own. And there are some products and different chemicals and things like that that you can add to the wines to make them clear faster. And that's something I'll probably save for another talk. But really, at this point, we would just allow the wine to sit and do its thing, and what will happen is all the sediment, all the particulates that are floating around in there, the yeast, the proteins, things like that, are just going to fall to the bottom of, we call this a carboy, fall to the bottom of a carboy and sit, and once it does that, I then rack all the clean wine, all the clean, clear wine into another clean container. And I do that probably about 2 to 3 times until the wine is completely clear. And at that point, I would be left with a totally fermented wine at that point that has been totally cleared. And then I'm ready to bottle it and cork it and put it away or drink it. And that essentially is Country Wine 101. That's the process right there. So I'm gonna keep you guys posted as I make this batch. For now, I'm just gonna let this cold soak for a couple more days. I'm gonna come back and inoculate it with yeast. That's really that, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks.